Is it? Oh, hello! Welcome to Webisode number 5. We're digging into the horror film. I was just talking to no one at all. Alright, so you should have, before watching this lecture, you should have looked at or read thoroughly the excerpt from the horror film Reader. That's the Jankovic assortment of essays and his introduction. So we're going to begin. I want to structure this as 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be on Jankovic's introduction. It's going to be a broad, simplified overview of the history of the horror film. How many of you are fans of horror films? I wonder which ones you've seen. Of course, because I'm speaking to you through a computer screen, we can't actually interact. So I can ask the question, and then I hope you will answer it by maybe commenting on this or in the discussion forum. Alright, history of the horror film, where to begin? Well, a good place to begin is probably German Expressionism. We're not going to go too much into detail today about German Expressionism, especially because the next reading you're going to do and the film you're going to watch by the end of this week 4 is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a great early German Expressionist film. The essay you're going to read is going to talk us through some of these things. The main thing you need to know about German Expressionism, it was all about the psychology, the interior psychology of human beings. German Expressionists believed that the cinema was perhaps the best way to deal in things like dreams, because watching a film is the closest thing to experiencing a dream entering into you and you just kind of letting it happen. There's something about watching film that is deeply psychological. So, for German Expressionists, they did a lot of over-the-top aesthetic things. The key part was anti-realism. German Expressionists were all about the nightmarish, the impossible, the grotesque, and all these other things that are in your unconscious, but could not be found in the real world. So the setting was all very over-the-top, excessive. Another thing about the German Expressionists that's worth noting, they are believe that their art form is high art. They're going to cling to the idea that through their films and their other forms of art, they can say something that would be like great art. They're going to say that they have a kind of elevated sensibility, that it is something that is thoughtful and deep. So, the early horror films, the early German Expressionist films, which date back into the 1920s, were, even though a lot of the time they were on a low budget and they had the intention of being kind of low budget shockers of sorts, they are still self-consciously artistic. Juxtapose that with some of the horror films we're going to talk about later on, and you'll see there's a clear difference here. But in German Expressionists, it is supposed to be self-consciously an artistic kind of expression. A couple of films that are worth noting here, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922, one of the earliest vampire films, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1926. I'm going to have clips of a lot of the films I'm going to mention on our YouTube channel, so I suggest you go check them out. If you can't watch the entire film on your own, it's at least worth getting a flavor for what does Nosferatu look like. Let me kind of get a sensation of what those early German Expressionist films were like. Alright, shortly thereafter, moving down the line, we come to Universal, Hammer Films, these kinds of things, 1930s. Going along with the 1920s theme, in the 1930s, these Universal Pictures films were very much based on the respectability of the Gothic genre, Gothic literature itself. And that's why we have in 1931 James Whale's Frankenstein and Todd Browning's Dracula. We've read the great literary works, and it is perhaps not a surprise that in a genre trying to self-consciously be artistic, they would hearken back to the great literary monsters that preceded them. That's where we get Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff's immortalized presentation of these characters. Again, I've already posted those clips on YouTube, but you should check them out. So 1920s and 1930s shared in common a sense of respectability, high artistic ambition, a hearkening back to their Gothic predecessors. Flash forward a little bit, there wasn't a lot of going on in the 1940s. For obvious reasons, there was that little thing, World War II, going on. That happened to, there were still horror films that were produced during this time, but a lot of them were propaganda or were not very worthy of note. We start seeing another turn in the horror film, though, in the 1950s. And the big thing that Jankovic mentions, and this is really where sci-fi and horror mix together and blur, the alien invasion films. Alien invasion films tap into anxieties about the nuclear war. We know at this time it's the Cold War. Everyone's afraid a nuclear bomb is going to come flying in at any given second. Also fear of radioactivity. What does it mean to have nuclear material amongst us? That's a very serious concern of the populace. So a lot of these alien invasion films are about tiny things that become gigantic ants, gigantic things like this become huge monsters. You could think even of King Kong as an example of something small that becomes huge earlier in time. But the difference here is that now little things are becoming huge due to nuclear activity. So this is a direct cause or direct effect of a nuclear cause. The main audience for these films, teenagers. And teenagers to this day are still the main consumer of the horror film genre. Not necessarily all men, which is the kind of stereotype. A lot of females enjoy watching this as well. It's a somewhat balanced group, but they are majority are teenagers. The reasons are very clear in the 1950s. This is a source of liberation for teenagers. They're going to take their date in the car, go to the drive-in, watch one of these alien invasion films. Hopefully their date will get a little bit scared and maybe hold their hand or something like this. So the teenage physical angst and physical reactions tag team well with the kind of gothic physicality we've already been talking about. It gets your heart racing, just like on your date with Betty to the drive-in. That was the 1950s name that came into my head. Betty in the car going to the drive-in. So these films are marked by being very melodramatic. Not great acting. If you've ever seen some of these, maybe on Mystery Science Theater or something like this, they are not exactly the highest quality. Unlike the 1920s and 1930s, these films are unabashedly just pop material, not hearkening back to any kind of respectability. They're quick to make, they're cheap, and they make a lot of money. So it was kind of the McDonald's toys of the horror film genre would be the 1950s. Great films to see, worth checking out. Obviously, Godzilla is a wonderful one coming out of Japan. Them, 1954, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956. So again, go look at some clips. Maybe you'll get tempted into watching one yourself if you're not too afraid. All right, 60s and 70s bring more of the same and more developments on a lot of things, but the next big development comes in the late 70s with the arrival of the slasher film. If you can remember all the way back to the first lecture, I said I think Jaws is kind of one of the major early slasher films, even though it's not a madman or monster with a knife attacking teenagers. It's a shark with knife-like teeth. Jaws, late 70s, is a big early predecessor, but the splash is John Carpenter's Halloween. You're probably aware of this film on some level. You've heard the theme song. We're going to talk about these slasher films a little bit later that kind of blow up in the 1980s. The 1980s would be the slasher film decade, if you had to choose a decade for this. Obviously, like I said, these films are based, again, designed for teenage audiences. They're based on teenage anxieties. Usually it's teenagers that are being threatened by monstrous sides of themselves. Michael Myers has the famous white William Shatner mask that's painted all white, and he just kind of attacks the teenage girls who are vulnerable. Not very far removed from Manfred in the Castle of Otranto. Similar, just irrational passions bursting onto the screen. Halloween, what that really, in terms of technique, introduces the first-person camera. If you watch the opening scene of Halloween, very famous, we are watching as if through the eyes of Michael Myers. And that first-person kind of shaky camera, handheld, creates a certain tension and a certain interesting, we go inside of the monster and eerily watch the victim. So we exchange perspectives. As sometimes we're looking through the eyes of the victim, sometimes we're looking through the eyes of the monster. And this is something that John Carpenter kind of innovates. The 1990s or late 80s into the 90s introduced body horror. And body horror, there's a lot of postmodern theorizing about this. I won't get into that here. If you're interested, I'm certainly happy to tell you more about this. But body horror is about the grotesque exploration of bodily functions. It's recognizing that we are very bodily creatures. Famous examples, David Cronenberg's films, throughout all of his films really do this, especially The Fly with Jeff Goldblum, classic sci-fi / horror that celebrates the mutations and the gross inner workings of the body. Another one is The Exorcist. That is the biggest, highest selling horror film of all time, The Exorcist. And if you know anything about the film, it is very excessive in its bodily depictions. When the devil enters into the young girl, it is from there a kind of devolution of the body itself. So, body horror, closely connected to slasher films, but a bit of a departure. So that kind of takes us up until today. I would leave it to you to talk about the 2000s, what that has brought to us. We have things like Paranormal Activity was very popular. So we could talk about technology. Also, I think The Ring, when we watch The Ring, will raise some of our contemporary anxieties and concerns. But we'll save that for another day. Jankovic also brings up an excellent critique, or a very common critique that you've probably heard about formula films. It is that they are predictable. And they're predictable because they are profitable. The two P's. Predictable, but profitable. Though that defines the horror film. It trains audiences to look for certain clues. Once you've seen enough slasher films, you know and can predict who's going to be the first to be destroyed by the monster. How do we know that? Where are the signals? You're able to read slasher films, and they become old hat. This is classically parodied by Wes Craven's Scream in 1996. If you ever seen that film or know about it, the entire film is built on the premise of horror films are predictable, and part of the fun is that we can learn to read them and know what to expect. Just because horror films, though, are a ritual or are familiar or predictable doesn't mean it's bad. We certainly live in a society in which people stress if it's predictable, if it's not surprising or new, it must be lame and old hat. That, I think, is something we need to take a look at further and think about really with some insight, because just because it's ritualistic doesn't mean that it's wrong, or doesn't mean that there isn't some inherent value to it. All right, with that being said, I want to move on to part 2. In part 2, we're going to ask a very important question. That question is, why horror? Why horror? And each of the early theorists in this collection, very famous early theorists, are going to give us some answers to why they think people are so drawn to horror films, and why other people are maybe less drawn to this particular genre. What's so attractive about seeing things that are so repulsive, that make us cringe, that make us uncomfortable? Hopefully you already can answer that question to some degree by talking about, why do we read Frankenstein? Why do we read Dracula? But it's, for some reason, it is the big question about horror films that people always ask, and one we have to attend to. First theorist, Robin Wood. Robin Wood writes in this essay one of the most famous arguments about why we're attracted to horror, that he believes that we are in a time of surplus repression. He believes that we are in a time in which we are driven by family, by proper manners, by a rigid society made up of rules and regulations. You must have a job, you must go to school for this long, you must get this on your SATs, you must go home at 5 o'clock and eat dinner with your family and then watch your television show and go to sleep. We are regimented in our day-to-day life. And so Robin Wood says horror films are really our collective nightmares. He calls them our collective nightmares. And what's at stake is normality itself. Normality is threatened by everything that is outside of the normal. He calls this, to borrow famously from Freud, he's going to say this is the return of the repressed. We act very confident and normal, but collectively we are bottling in or walling out all of these abnormal things. So he lists off some as sexuality, women, the poor, ethnicities, children. So all of these people, places, ideas are outside of normality, at least as normality is defined by modern contemporary society. But he says if you keep all of these things at bay, if you bottle them up or wall them out too much, eventually what will happen is it will boil over and it will come out in the form usually of a nightmare. So, horror films, the perfect venue. That's where we express and go to see our collective nightmares appear. So there's a kind of cathartic emotion to it, but it's also something that is unavoidable. Horror films for Robin Wood are an unavoidable product of a surplus repression. All right, the second reading, probably the second most, in the order of most well-known, second most widely read theory, Noel Carroll's cognitivist reading of the horror film. We need not be afraid of the term cognitivist, but the difference is Robin Wood is into psychoanalysis and believes it's all coming from our unconscious, whereas Noel Carroll is going to talk about how it is a basic human need. It is the mapping of our brain, the way that we do these things. That can explain for us why we physically are interested in the horror film. And he comes to quite different conclusions. For him, horror is a protracted series of discoveries, he says, fueled, in a sense, by curiosity. And here's what he means by this. If you think back to Jaws, again, a wonderful example, a lot of the movie is spent searching for the monster, fueling our curiosity. Well, how big is this shark exactly? What is a shark capable of? Where is he going to show up or be found beneath this huge ocean surface? When are we going to actually get to see the monster? And our curiosity leads us on, but deep down we know it's going to repulse us. We're not going to find it and say, oh, that's cute. He's a cute shark. That is probably not going to be our response. So if we know it's going to be repulsive, why do we go searching to discover it? Why is the path of the horror film to discover the monster so compelling? Well, Carroll's going to say it's compelling because the promise is something truly outside of the normal. It's something truly impossible or unknown. And we are spellbound to things that are genuinely unknown or impossible, things that go outside of our normal categories. We are spellbound to see those things, even if we know it will be upsetting, and it probably will be upsetting. We're captivated by what is outside of what we know. And this, in some ways, we can go back and look at the early Gothic as well as being a similar thing. Why are we pursuing Dracula? Why is Manfred so pursuant after these supernatural beings? Why do we continue to want to see Frankenstein's creature? Why the search? And Carroll's explanation is probably as justified as any other. He says, for art horror, the price we're willing to pay, the kind of the discomfort that we are willing to pay is to get a glimpse of the impossible or the unknown. We're willing to sacrifice our own comfort to see something totally new and unexpected. What makes this a routine exercise is that there is no fear that the shark is literally going to get us. There's no fear that the shark is going to, although I am sometimes nervous about this, but the shark is going to come out of the screen and consume us. There is no reason to be truly afraid, and so it's a pleasant experience. We get to have our heart race, our curiosity piqued, but we're under no real physical duress in the end. Finally, Andrew Tudor is the last essay. He makes two important points that I think we need to pay attention to. The first one, he categorizes horror into secure horror and paranoid horror. Secure horror is one in which we know it is predictable and we are comfortable in the routine of going through that horror. There's no fear that we genuinely don't know what the monster is because we can anticipate it, and there's something very comfortable. Secure horror is all about a sense of routine and comfort and not truly unsettling. The other form of horror is the paranoid. And the paranoid horror is one in which a world is truly unreliable. We don't know how this is going to play out. We don't know how the horror film ends. It could be at the end of the film that no one survives, or that the monster does unspeakable things that we could not anticipate. So if the world is unreliable and unpredictable, it's paranoid horror. It's secure horror if we can predict or anticipate the outcome and we still enjoy the ride without any real strain. The second important thing that Tudor talks about that we must attend to is that he, unlike Wood and unlike Carroll before him, believes there is no universal answer to the question, why horror? He doesn't think there's a single answer to this. He says that actually there's so many different people who have so many different reactions that it is fool's gold to try and say, here's why we like horror. Because who is we? And what kind of horror are we talking about? So he kind of takes a step back and says, let's not jump to any huge conclusions about things. The question on 54 is an important one. He rephrases it. Why do these people like this horror in this place at this particular time? And this is going to be important for us as we move forward. When we watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari later this week, you're going to not ask yourself, why does everybody love that kind of horror? You're going to ask yourself, why do Germans in the 1920s really like that kind of horror? Not even all Germans, but why do some Germans find that to be compelling? Just like in the 30s, when you think about America and Great Britain, why did they find Universal Pictures and Hammer films to be so appropriate for their time and their place among those particular individuals? So we can't answer the question in the end for Tudor, and I happen to agree with this. We can't answer with a conclusive, here's why we love horror films. But instead, as any rigorous form of scholarship does, we must pay attention to the particular aspects of each case. So, hopefully this is a good overview for thinking about why horror films, why do we watch them, what's the draw, why are they so compelling to people. I look forward to hearing more from you on the discussion post. When you watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, take great pleasure. It is one of the classics. And please do go to the YouTube channel and check out clips from the various films that I've mentioned. It's well worth the visit. All right, I'll talk to you next time. Thank you kindly.